everybody for the big session? Okay, now, I'm John Urquhart. I want to spend the next 4 hours discussing the $64,000 trillion question, the role of genomic instability in the destiny of the species. But unfortunately, the organisers have told me that I've only got 14 minutes plus a few minutes for questions. So unfortunately, I've had to put it all in this book. So cameraman, please zoom in on the book if there may be YouTube viewers watching. Okay. Right. So now we start off with this estimable slide over there, which you've seen before, from Mary, which is a description of what happens to people who were exposed at Hiroshima and Nagasaki and their subsequent cancer history. That is part of what I call the second wave of genomic instability, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Does anyone know what the first wave was in modern times? I'll give you a clue. It happened on June the 8th, 1783. Right, no
Was that
answer.
your birthday?
Yes, historically it probably was. Not quite at the Battle of Culloden, but there you go. Anyway, it was in fact the day that the Laki volcano took off in Iceland and spewed 142 billion tons of material into the atmosphere. And you can bet some of those are responsible for genomic instability response. Now, this is a fascinating graph, but there is a missing gap in it. It's not Mary's fault, it's the fault of the Japanese-US Commission, who didn't actually observe anything to do with cancer and leukemia in the first 5 years since the atomic bomb went off in 1945, which meant that all children who died of leukemia before the age of 5, attributable to that explosion, are not counted. And we are very interested in children under 5. Why? Partly because there are a lot of young children in Sellafield who've got leukemia, and more importantly, because when they did what I call the Ku Klux Klan study and the German nuclear power plants, the KKK study, they found that the only effect that they could detect was that there were 37 cases of under 5 leukemia within 5 kilometers of that plant, as opposed to 17 expected. So there's a gap in the knowledge. Well, there was a gap until the Swedish scientists, in their wisdom, decided to zap children with high levels of radiation from about the 30s to the 60s. Why? Because they wanted to get rid of their port wine stains. If they're successful in getting rid of the stains, these children were under 12 months, but unfortunately some of them got leukemia. And they then published a paper, and they looked at the number of leukemias that occurred to that group, that cohort of children. And guess what? They came up with a conclusion that it was very similar to what you expect with the existing paradigm about the effects of radiation. Well, I looked at that paper, and there were two basic mistakes in it. First of all, it didn't look at the under 5 leukemia rates. Okay? This is the area that we think is the most sensitive, as emphasized by this particular graph. And secondly, they did a terrible thing. They said, well, we will compare the rate of deaths with what the national rate was, we think, in the 30s and 40s in Sweden. They haven't got a clue. So what did they use? They used the modern levels. Well, everybody knows that in those days, if you died of leukemia, you didn't even notice you died. You probably died of an infection because it was pre-antibiotic. So they looked at the wrong denominator when they looked at the numerator. When you back calculated, as I did, you find that the what's called the doubling dose effects of radiation in that group of children under 12 months is in fact similar, very similar to the doubling dose that is caused by X-rays of fetuses. Now, you might say, well, surely it's a bit not as bad as that, but don't forget, Fetuses don't breathe. Children under 12 months do breathe, and when they breathe in radiation particles. Okay, so now I want you to look at your first graph, which is, bearing this in mind, we now looked at what I call the fourth wave, which was the Chernobyl accident. That occurred on April the 26th, 1986. And what we're looking at there is the possible health impact of Chernobyl on children in England and Wales. Now, the first thing you will notice is spiky. There are 2 spikes in it. And Wales is important because it was on one of the 3 arms, I haven't got 3 arms, so I can't demonstrate, but was on one of the 3 arms of pollution, radioactive pollution, that crossed the UK after the Chernobyl accident and was intercepted by storm forces and rain washout. And there's a special paper by the Met Office that explains it sucked down radioactive debris. So when you look at Wales, you're looking at an example of that part of the world where there was an excess of radiation. And what do you find when you look at the graph? Well, you can see immediately there are 2 spikes. 2 spikes, put it that way. Winston Churchill. Right, here we go. The first spike occurs in the cohort that was born in the 1985-86. In other words, any child that had, I managed to get hold of some data, national data, which looked at the age of diagnosis and the age of the child at the time, up to under the age of 3. You conflate those together and you can go work backwards and say, this is a cohort that was being born about the time of 1985-86. The next cohort that is significant is not the next year, funnily enough, it's the year after, right? The 87-88 cohort. Okay, so what does this imply? Well, it implies, first of all, that when we look at the effects of radiation fallout on leukemia, we should not be looking necessarily at a simple, straightforward, how many kids got leukemia in a particular year. We've got to go back and look at when they were born. Okay? Now, when you do that, you find this amazing peak in Wales, that the average is under 6, and you've got 12 cases in those 2 cohorts, each of them. That may not seem very significant, but from a statistical point of view, it is. It's a sort of experiment you could carry out on batches of shells exploding. You go along, you find, well, the average is about 6, 7, 8, or 9, or probably 5. Suddenly we get 12. Oh, that's a bad batch. So that is your null hypothesis, right? The Welsh data is the null hypothesis. Something was going wrong in those 2 years. What was going wrong? Well, the hypothesis is very simple. The children who were born in the 87-88 cohort were born to fathers whose sperm and their sperm systems were affected by the fallout from Chernobyl. The children who were born in the 85-86 cohort were about under 12 months when the Chernobyl fallout struck. So in other words, you've got a double whammy effect. And once you start thinking about leukemia, childhood leukemia in that age group, as a double whammy effect, you then have a very interesting explanation for what was happening at Sellafield. We had an excess, 10-fold excess of childhood leukemia in Sellafield, and then they turned around and said, yes, but that should have occurred to all the children of workers, of Sellafield workers, right through Cumbria. But of course, the children of the workers in Sellafield who had the high levels were exposed locally to higher levels of radiation. In other words, you have what's called genomic instability to sensitize your immune ability to have leukemia, and then you have what you might call the trigger, right? The trigger is what happens the second time. You need 2 components to get childhood leukemia under the age of 3 or 4. Okay, so far, so good. This is just a hypothesis. Now I want you to look carefully again at that Welsh data. And what do you see? Well, you go back to the cohort from 1975-76, and you find no leukemias at all.
Once again, that is highly statistically significant. And what happened between May 1975 and September 1976 in Britain?
The drought.
What?
The drought.
The Great Drought, when it didn't rain ever. And it was worse in the western part of Britain. It was really dried up. So I went and looked back at two of the regions next to Wales, southwest and northwest, and guess what? The reduction in childhood leukemia, which is a much bigger area, was actually 80% in that 75-76 cohort. So here we have an interesting point that you can get an excess of childhood leukemia through radiation, but you can get a deficiency if you don't have a radiation, i.e. naturally occurring radiation. And it's this factor which is the most important that I want you to consider today, because it means that because of the pressure of vested interests, nobody is interested in the effect of natural radiation on young children, or indeed on young fertile men, or whatever, right? But if we had been interested, over the last 20 years, we could have saved up to 2,000 unnecessary leukemias in children. So that's one thought I want you to take away with you. So now, the question is, what do we do about it? Well, we can extend that philosophy of genomic instability to other areas. We can look, for example, back at the German study and say, well, wait a minute, these children, they were exposed possibly to this change in fuels and so on, but they were also, and that was giving them a trigger, but they were also living in an environment where they were also suffering, their parents were suffering, or certainly their father was suffering, genomic instability. And that explains a very tight circle of why you have this doubling effect within 5 kilometers, but almost immediately you don't have any effect at all beyond 5 kilometers. So here's a cogent explanation of what's going on. The implications, of course, of this study is it's all about childhood leukemia, because it's also, in my opinion, it's all about genomic instability. And so when we go back to our 5 waves of genomic instability, we have the Icelandic volcano, we have the second wave, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, we have the third wave, which is actually not children, but it's actually the Grapple Y test on April the 28th, 1958, where we've also found a huge increase in birth defects and in third generation effects. Fourth wave is Chernobyl, and the fifth wave, which I haven't had an opportunity to examine, because as you know, there's a great deal of sensitivity about the health impact of Fukushima, as yet to be determined. Now I'm going to stop there, and I'm going to answer questions.
Very concise.
Everyone is completely bamboozled, which is a good sign, actually.
Yes.
John, do you have a...
Can you speak up, because I didn't bring in my Geordie translators, and I can't hear a damn thing. So go on, yeah.
This is Mary. Thank you for handing about this graphs that you've given us. Are they in a longer text? Do you have a paper?
In the book,
Okay,
there is a very long discussion.
good.
The book is in the form mainly of a Socratic dialogue. I'm bringing it back into fashion. And it's actually, you'll be pleased to hear that the 2 leading advocates are women, not men, discussing it. So that is an important aspect. There's a gender aspect to this book as well. You'll be pleased about that. So they discuss this whole question of the gap and the implications. They discuss a whole lot of other things. Have a good read of it. And the point is, as we all know, this subject is very, very complicated. It has many facets to it. And you can't actually you can only pick out one small little point in a lecture. And I would say the starting point, where you pull on the wool, as it were, is that Swedish study and say, wait a minute, what was really happening to these poor kids who were being zapped by radiation under the age of 12 months? Can you believe it? It's just impossible to believe, but it's true. Right, so it's in the book description. There will eventually be a scholar's edition where you'll get the references. But for the moment, this book, I hasten to add, is aimed at the lay reader as well as those who are scientifically tuned up. Okay, next question. Right, well, while you're thinking about the next question, I'll now go on to another aspect of this piece of paper that I've given you. One of the inspirations for getting into this research was that an early study that I carried out in the year 2000 for a low-level radiation conference in Dublin. And I said to Carmel, who's not here, but I said, well, it's fine, I'll get all the speakers, you organise the conference. And so the first thing I did, obviously, was ring up the National Radiological Protection Board and said, oh, I'd like to know what you've done on the health impact of Chernobyl. And they said, what impact? They smugly. So I thought, well, I'll have to, little red hen, I'll have to write it myself. So I started looking at the data, and in the data I discovered that the best place to look, obviously, is something like infant mortality levels. Had they been affected by the Chernobyl fallout? And I found that there was, in fact, an increase in the southwest. And I put this into the paper, and it got into the media. And immediately, an NRPB guy called Michael Clark came back and said, well, the fallout never reached Bristol. But of course he was wrong. And I know he was wrong because 2 years later I got hold of his original paper from the Met Office, where he was a co-author, where they showed these 3 plumes coming across Britain. So what I did then was, I knew exactly where the plumes were, I knew where the debris was coming on, and I overlaid the plume map with a map of 193 hospital districts. And there was neonatal deaths for each of those districts, 193 districts. And then I compared one level with another level. And you can see from the next graph, which is figure 4 in front of you, you can see it's a plot of neonatal deaths over that period of time between basically 85 and 88. And you'll see immediately that the black rain areas, what I call the black rain areas, there was an increase of neonatal deaths against current trend, whereas in the dry areas that weren't affected, there was a continuing downward trend. Now that, of course, isn't absolute scientific proof, but it's very, very interesting. And that's an example where if you start doing the statistics and starting doing the epidemiology, you begin to pick up the fact that something very awful was going on about the time of that Chernobyl accident, even in Britain. Now the great advantage of Britain, as opposed to other countries, is that it, up to then, it had very good health statistics. So you could go through the original health statistics and say what was really happening, okay? So there's another graph you might want to ponder. Okay, next question.
John,
Yeah.
in some areas, there were people reporting the fallout in terms of very hot particles that included North Wales in their garden.
Yeah.
What impact like that? We're coming back to very uneven dispersal of different types of radionuclides.
There was very uneven, and in fact, I personally, I believe, was a victim of fallout because, and I don't know if any of you had this experience, what happened was soon after Chernobyl, I began to get an itch in my eye. And I went on to the optician and he said, well, people are reporting this all over the place and they think it was due to hot particles coming down being caught in the eye, right? It was a short-lived radiation hot particle. But of course, the point is that when you have washout, you have an amazing amount of fallout associated with washout, which brings me nicely to the last graph and to the next speaker, which is, the question is if you have natural radiation being one of the causes of, say, childhood leukemia, how do you measure it? And if you look at that last graph, figure 13, you will say that we have looked at the effect of naturally occurring rainfall associated with increased levels of gamma radiation for the next 2 or 3 hours afterwards. Now, if you look at that graph, you will see that even after the rainfall had stopped, there were still lots of particles floating around. You're only looking at gamma, but the point is that gamma is a surrogate for all the sorts of internal particles that are coming down naturally occurring. Now we think, and Graham will back this up, we think that these sort of what we call occluded reflux and so on, with acid rain, because acid rain is important because it contains ceramic particles that act as magnets for the naturally occurring radioactivity such as polonium-210 and things like that. We think that these naturally occurring higher levels, which would be going on for millions of years, by the way, we think that these in Britain occur about twice a year on average. Okay? So if you're out with your pram with your 6-year-old granddaughter, right, and the sirens go, because that's what we're going to have in Kurdistan, lots of sirens, and you will actually be then leaping inside because you know it's a possibility of acid rain and natural fallout, which in the long run is far more dangerous, probably, than anything you're going to get from nuclear power. Okay? Any more questions?
John, it's a bit difficult. It's always raining in Hunterston.
So you have to speak up. What?
John, it's always raining at Hunterston.
Well, you'll probably be okay because it probably rained out what was there already.
All right.
Yeah, but you know, but just don't take the pram out too often. That's all. Right. Right. So there's a new way of looking at things, but it does bring me on to a final point, which I want to talk about, and that is what I call smug science. Ever since the Black Report that was built onto the Windscale nuclear laundry film, we've had this thing called COMARI, which incidentally is Italian for godmother. COMARI stands for Committee on Medical Aspects of Radiation in the Environment. Very significant, the dog didn't bark. Did COMARI ever do any proper studies of the possible health impact of Chernobyl from a radiation environment? The unique radiation experiment that was carried out in this country between May the 2nd and May the 3rd, 1986. No, they didn't. Every time you put through some new ideas to COMARI, it's poo-pooed. They're very comfortable with what the so-called virus theory, which incidentally is attacked in the book as well. And so it's what I call smug science. And so they are, in my opinion, acting as an intellectual block to any development in this country of new thinking about what is really happening with radiation. It doesn't mean to say that what I'm promoting is correct. I'm just saying you're up against a huge block of what I call smug science. Right, everyone's gone there quiet again. Just one final point. I have some actual handouts about COMARI where they say on their website, not a single member of COMARI has ever worked for the nuclear industry nor the electricity supply industry. But when you look at the reports produced by COMARI, 17 reports, you will find declaration of members' interest, you will find at least 5 names who've either worked for or have been consulted to the nuclear power industry. So it's rather disingenuous to say that your members of COMARI aren't, you know, it's like aren't members of anything to do with the nuclear industry. But the people who actually do the hard work and produce the reports, some of them have these connections. Nothing wrong with that, but you have to be aware, that there's more than one interest in operating. And so their statement actually is not factually correct. So, now, anything else you would like to know? One final point I want to make is that I think now we are actually right up against it. I think that we are getting a situation, and you will see this in the book, that we will be having what's called a genetic epidemic. That is, that groups of people will have genomic instability, which acts, as it were, as a dominant gene and is promoting it through different generations, not through no fault of their own. Now, if that is the case, the problem is you don't actually know who's got genomic instability. You do know that certain groups are probably likely to have genomic instability. And you could perhaps start adding some of the minor, what I call genomic instability events. You might actually add the population of Fallujah that was bombarded with depleted uranium, which is a known effect. You might add some of the people who live around the Byker incinerator plant in Newcastle, which was spewing out dioxin, which is again a known source of genomic instability. Or you might include descendants of the Australian volunteers who were in Vietnam from Agent Orange, which also was dioxin. So unfortunately, we have potential sources, and we don't really know enough about the long-term implications of what this is going to happen to basically the human race. We don't know to what extent there is a genetic pandemic going on. We don't know how big it is. We don't know if it's expanding. We don't know if it's self-limiting. So I'll leave you with that thought so you can sleep well tonight and go on. Thank you.
Tim's got a question for you.
Sorry?
Tim's got a question.
Yeah, I got a question for you, John. Did you, one of the things we've noticed in the birds, in particular in Chernobyl, is male sterility in the most radioactive areas. And in the mice, we've seen declines in swimming ability or endurance. And so for big fertility effects especially, well, we've only really looked at the males carefully.
Yeah.
And recently, last year, I think there was a report out of, I think it was on the BBC website, about, in response to this response of global decline, well, now, Western male fertility is dropping off. It's dropped off by 50% in the last 30 or 40 years. And the BBC suggested that this could be our doom as a species. The humans were heading towards extinction. Did you see those articles, and did you have any thoughts on them?
Well, funnily enough, as a statistician, there's a story to distort Louis Pasteur's famous dictum, in the field of discovery, chance favours the bored mind. I used to work in a library, and I got very interested in the statistics that were coming through. And one of the things I looked at was the ratio of non-identical twins to identical twins in the national statistics.
Sure.
And what I found was that not just in Britain, but in Australia and also America, one state in America, in 1964, there was a sudden drop in that ratio of non-identical twins to identical twins. And I subsequently learned that this is a very good measure of fertility, right? Now, since then, of course, the whole thing's been messed up with IVS and everything, so you never know where you are with it. But at that time, it was a very interesting statistic, and of course, it was associated, if you like, with the last great big splurge of nuclear fallout, which was 1963. I'm not saying it was the nuclear fallout that caused it. I'm just saying that was possibly an indicator of a drop in fertility even then.
Interesting. One of our colleagues, Vladimir Werdlecki, he's an MD geneticist out of Alabama. He's been studying neural tube defects in Chernobyl children. And it turns out that identical twinning is actually a kind of developmental abnormality. At least he clumps it in with that, into that group of neural tube defects. And apparently the frequency of identical twinning, I think, is increased in these more radioactive areas. I think that's in one of his papers, as I recall. So that would be consistent, I guess, with what you're suggesting.
Yeah, I mean, they're all linked, but of course, the key problem in this whole game, as you know, is to get hard data to which you can, and then possibly set up your prior hypothesis, which I hoped I did with the Welsh data. And then you set up your prior hypothesis, and then you begin to have explanation for a lot of apparently unconnected facts, such as, for example, why is it that only under 5 leukemias are prominent around German nuclear power plants? What's really going on with Sellafield? And these sort of questions. So it's a question of developing a comprehensive view, and I believe myself, having studied the problem, and I think other people would also agree there, is that genomic instability and the whole question of what happens with radiation, both artificial and natural, is part of the story.
Thank you, Noel.
Okay.